Israel's recent strike on Qatar, a U.S. ally not directly involved in the conflict, has sent shockwaves across the Middle East. What does this mean for diplomacy, sanctions, and the future of the Middle East? In this video, we'll break down what happened, the global reactions, and how this could reshape alliances and the future of international diplomacy.
I think it is a big deal here that Israel decided to strike Qatar here. Qatar is a major U.S. partner. This has real implications. Qatar wasn't even involved in any sort of conflict with Israel, even in the broadest definition. A lot of these attacks on Yemen or Syria or Lebanon, these are actions that are taken under this broad self-defense rubric. But it doesn't fall under that category. This is something different. This is assassinating political negotiators in a supposedly, country that's supporting the mediation. So this is different. So it's possible that it could change attitudes in Europe. But it depends a little bit sort of what the blockages are. Are the reasons why these European states are not supporting sanctions, are they actually on the substance, or are they political issues? Are they do they have to do with backroom deals or political optics? And if that's the case, then they may not change. So it's hard to say. But I do think that we have seen over the past several months a real growing swell of countries trying to do something, whether it's sanctions or recognizing a Palestinian state or other types of sort of symbolic gestures. And we could have a separate debate about whether or not these things help or hurt. But I do think it's a reflection of the international community sort of trying to struggle with what is the best way to respond to this. And I think the important point to make here is that the United States has a lot more leverage and a lot more tools on this issue than any other country that we're talking about. It is U.S. weapons that Israel depends on. It is U.S. diplomatic support that Israel depends on. So if the United States decided to take a stronger stance to stop what we're seeing in the region, both in Gaza and elsewhere, we might see a bigger impact than even the collective move by the European Union.
And I'm sorry, as we're talking here, we have some additional information that's coming out here. Amir Ohana, who is the Speaker of the Knesset in Israel, far from any kind of embarrassment or backing down or anything else, just published on X. It says, "This is a message to all the Middle East." And he shows a video of the explosion, basically telling everybody this is going to continue on. And then it's kind of an in-your-face reaction here. Meanwhile, the GCC, the Gulf Coalition Coordination, Gulf Cooperation Council, has expressed complete support for Qatar and condemnation of Israel on there. So you just got to look and see how this is going to unfold even in the coming hours. Is probably going to be very telling here. But I mean, Israel could be setting up a you're with us or you're against this kind of an issue, and may push people over the fence to say, hey, then we're against you, because I mean, Turkey already is. And let me ask your opinion. What do you think? Let's look at some of the regions there. What about Jordan and Egypt in particular? Because they would seem to be coming under the most maybe domestic pressure to do something different.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that once you start threatening all the other countries in your region, you're setting yourself up for a balancing coalition against you. I do think that it is important to recognize how out of the norm it is for another country to just go around bombing all of its neighbors. It's hard to know, it's hard to keep count of how many of its neighbors and other countries in the region Israel is currently in some sort of conflict with. Egypt and Jordan, I think, will come under pressure. It's hard to say how far they'll go in sort of adjusting their posture. And I think that will be a significant point to watch. I think looking at how Egypt views its relationship with Israel will be especially important, given that they do have a longstanding peace agreement between the two, although relations are sometimes tense. And so watching how that relationship evolves over the next couple of days, I think will be important. I think looking at Turkey is also very important. I mean, there are some in Israel talking about a war with Turkey next, right? So how does Turkey respond when it starts to see Israel aggressively attacking even U.S. partners? I think there will be a lot of shifting in views here. I do think that this is something different. This is not just another Israeli target assassination. This is something different that we should be looking at in that way.
It seems to me that there is this belief in Israel, and I've seen lots of people already, some of the social media and elsewhere, to include U.S. Senator Fetterman, who was literally posted a picture of a happy Winnie the Pooh dancing and in happiness about all this that had happened. So there's certainly lots of people in that camp too, but it seems to me we're in danger of getting to a point to where might makes right. And it doesn't matter about international law. We don't care about that. We'll kill whoever we want, whoever our side wants, as long as it's somebody we don't like. And that we can do so with impunity. And given the Knesset's speaker right there, he seems to think that they do have impunity. And it kind of implies that there's no upper limit on any of this. And anything else is possible as long as you said a second ago, the U.S. keeps providing diplomatic and military support to Israel.
Well, I think we should be honest that might has always made right. I mean, that's always been the case. We like to pretend that it's not. We like to pretend that, when the U.S. military has used force in the Middle East or elsewhere, that it's been in support of democracy or to protect the liberal order or, whatever euphemism we're using at the time. But might has always made right. But I do think that what we're seeing in the Middle East right now is an extreme version of this. Where one country is acting with impunity against all of its neighbors, and it's a really sharp contrast with how the United States talks about countries like Russia and China when they use military force in their neighborhoods. This is seen as a violation of international law and a violation of norms like the territorial integrity norm, and that doesn't seem to apply here. It's a real contradiction, and this is something that I think countries across the global South have picked up on and are aware of. And it's one of the reasons why the U.S. is sort of losing some of the authority and influence that it used to have in those regions, and why we saw last week, which we talked about on this show, a lot of countries sort of flocking to the message that Xi Jinping was offering of global governance. And you can poke lots of holes in it, but it certainly sounds a lot more peaceful and a lot more stable than what we see under U.S. leadership in the Middle East.
By the way, I have a little bit more breaking news here. This is now Al Jazeera is reporting that Qatar officials say that Hamas leadership has survived the Israeli leadership assassination. Senior Hamas member Sohail al-Hindi tells Al Jazeera that the group's leadership survived the attack, which another source said happened as the negotiating team was discussing a ceasefire proposal put forward by the United States. We'll see how that's going to happen too. Israel said they were very confident that they were killed, but now Hamas is saying it's not. I guess time will tell how that turns out. But, the fact that they specifically said, while we're in the process of negotiating about the American ceasefire, it just kind of underscores what you already said a bit ago earlier, that this can't help but have negative ramifications for U.S. diplomacy writ large. And this kind of thing is really hard to recover from, especially when there's no effort or no apparent interest in correcting this situation or recognizing that it's wrong. And you mentioned it, the burst, but let's look a little bit more at it right now. We're in negotiations with Russia right now. Trump is, to try and find some kind of either resolution or a 30-day ceasefire, et cetera, some kind of end to this war, which Trump keeps saying, I think we're going to get this done. He's supposed to meet with Putin, I guess on the phone sometime this week. He's supposed to meet with European leaders. Where is the probability that Russia is going to feel like that they can engage with a good faith actor in the United States to get this war over?
Well, I think that space is sort of rapidly diminishing. I think there was a lot of hope on the Russian side initially when Trump came in that they could, sit down at the negotiating table, that there could be an end to the war. Not immediately. I'm not suggesting that Putin was ready to settle or even that he's ready to settle now, but he is, I think, ready to bargain in a serious process where they can hash out the specific terms of the agreement or some kind of settlement. And that's not something necessary that Trump and Putin would do directly. That's something that would happen largely at the working level. But I don't think there's any kind of faith right now that that kind of process can be sustained. Or that Trump would necessarily stick with the deal once they agreed to it. He seems to change his mind and his approach to Ukraine as well as other regions, sort of daily almost. And that is disconcerting for any country that's looking to strike a deal with the United States. How do you know that the deal that you strike today will be valid tomorrow? How do you know that a commitment to negotiate today won't be blown up by a missile the next day? So I do think that it raises a lot of questions for the Russian side on how worth it is to engage seriously in negotiations rather than just sort of push on the battlefield until the battlefield decides what the outcome is.
Yeah, that does seem to be the most likely outcome at this point. Before I let you go, I want to pull the lens back out a little bit further, maybe like to the 30,000 foot level. And how do you think this fits in with the already deteriorating situation with Western leadership and the rules-based order and all that international law that we used to tout all the time? You said might has always made right. At least there has been the attempt, or at least the image that we want to say, no, there is a rules-based order and all this kind of stuff nominally. Now it looks like we're just taking off the nominal part here, and it's just hardcore power politics. And what impact is that going to have when you look at where the global center of balance of power may be shifting to the east with BRICS or the SCO? We just saw, already we've got these punitive tariffs on India, which instead of in any way trying to draw them into our world where it seems we're shoving them in the other, this seems like it's kind of piling on top of that, which all the other countries, whether it's the global south or other countries in Asia, it seems like we're giving people more reason to fear us in a bad way, not in a respectful way, and to maybe think that there's more stability and safety in another pole. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, my statement that might has always made right, I think the rules-based order is a little bit of a fiction. It's always sort of been rules-based order for everyone else, but not for the United States. The United States can act and violate those rules when it wants to, and it doesn't. But the trend has been that it didn't always violate them, right? Like it observed them most of the time and would pick and choose its spaces. But that now I think we see sort of a total disregard for the rules-based order, total disregard for international law. The U.S. does what it wants, when it wants, and where it wants, and are proud of it, right? We saw that with the Venezuela strike. We saw that with statements that Hegseth and Vice President Vance have made about the Venezuela strike. And we see it here in the Middle East, not necessarily the U.S. acting with impunity, but the U.S. empowering its partner Israel to act with impunity. I'm not a big fan of the rules-based order. I thought it was always a fiction. I don't necessarily think that it has had the stabilizing effect that a lot of people do. But it is useful to have, some set of agreed upon norms by which everyone sort of loosely operates. And the U.S. has sort of destroyed any pretense that it is operating by those rules at this point. The United States likes to call Russia and China revisionist actors, but really the most revisionist actor that we've seen over the past 8 months has been the United States. It's not a value judgment. That's just sort of a fact. And so I think that for countries looking for a little bit more stability or a little bit more order, China has offered a potentially reasonable model. They're not looking to be a global hegemon in the way the U.S. has, underwriting the global economy or underwriting the security of 50 nations or however many countries now have U.S. security guarantees. But they are looking to provide some set of basic guidelines by which states would behave, a set of operating principles that would guide how states interact with each other, and that's appealing. And I think we saw that last week. I think in a world that seems chaotic, this multipolar world vision that Xi Jinping has offered is appealing to a lot of states, and these types of actions only reinforce that. So I do think that poses not necessarily a threat to the United States, but it is a change in the balance of power that we're seeing, and it is partly driven by U.S. actions.
And do you see any prospect anywhere, even on the distant horizon, to where anyone, whether that's in Europe or even other poles of power in the United States, could maybe say, all right, this is over the line, this is too far, we have to push back on this and bring the pendulum back in the other direction?
I do think that in the Middle East, it seems hard to fathom, really, the Trump administration taking a strong stance against Israel at this point. which is disappointing, but I think it's true. And I don't know how much sway the rest of the international community has. I think we'll have to watch over the next couple of days. We can see how things play out. Maybe this makes a difference for the Trump administration, but so far they haven't been willing really to break from Israel. And in terms of more globally, in terms of how they're thinking, I think they're still very focused on this power politics model. And I don't know if I've said it before on this show, but I've said it before in other places, that to me, it seems like the administration really wants all the benefits of being the global hegemon, all the power and all the influence that comes with it, but without having to pay any of the costs, without having to have any sort of the responsibilities of a global hegemon. And I think that will continue, and that causes chaos, because you can't have the influence of a global hegemon without the responsibilities. That's not how it works. And so I think we see U.S. policy sort of ricocheting and having all these unintended consequences because there's this like fundamental disconnect in the strategy that the administration is using.
And last question, is there a point beyond which, whether it's the GCC or just a grouping of the Middle Eastern nations, whether individually or in some grouping or so, could finally say, we've just had it with the U.S. We're not going to follow your lead anymore. We're going to follow what our own independent course is that's for our benefit? Or will they just suck this down too and just keep on going under the status quo that's reigned for decades?
It's a little bit hard to say, but I think the things to watch are, number one, what happens with the Abraham Accords? Do these things stay in place, or do countries start pulling back from them? They have economic benefits, but countries in the region could decide that they are just no longer worth it. If you saw a cascade movement away from these agreements to sort of make them void, that I think would have an impact on the region. It might also have an impact on the Trump administration. Trump is very proud of those negotiations, so that's something that could influence U.S. decision making. I think a lot depends what Saudi Arabia does. And I think it depends how they decide to approach Iran. I think another thing to watch is whether countries in the region, seeing the United States maybe not as their friend, move to normalize ties with Iran more directly, and even more than they have so far, and sort of give up on the U.S. approach to dealing with Iran. So I think those are two things to watch that would suggest a real shift in how the region is thinking about its relationship with the United States.
And I'm sorry, I'm gonna cheat. I said that was the last question. It turns out there's one more, because you reminded me of something here. We're also allegedly in diplomatic engagement with Iran to still try and figure some way to get this whole nuclear program under control, which the airstrikes damaged it, but it certainly didn't end anything. Is there any prospect that Tehran will have any interest in talking to the United States after this?
Well, I certainly don't think this helps. I mean, the issue with Iran is sort of the same issue that we've been talking about, which is this credibility issue. The last time Iran was at the negotiating table, engaged in what it thought were serious negotiations, and it was attacked not once but twice, first by Israel and then by the United States. So in order to return to the negotiating table, especially around the topic of giving up their nuclear enrichment capabilities and potentially other military capabilities, right, like their missile, their ballistic missile technology is also on the table here. To give those things up, they'll need really credible assurances from the United States that they're not going to be attacked again by Israel or the United States. And giving those types of assurances was difficult before. It's going to be even more difficult now that this has happened. So I think that this, may not be a decisive factor that breaks progress back to the negotiating table, but it certainly doesn't help.
So absent any kind of a deal from Iran, is there still the prospect of more conflict between the United States and Iran?
Well, there's definitely prospect of more conflict between Israel and Iran. I mean, I think, Trita Parsi at Quincy has wrote about this, that, another Israel-Iran conflict is probably looming in the near future. It's hard to imagine that the U.S. doesn't get involved in some way. Now, it will have to look different than last time. The big bunker buster bombs that the United States used, we only had a limited stockpile, and we used over 2/3 of that stockpile in the last attack. So any future attack would have to look very different, because we couldn't rely on those same capabilities in the same way. So the U.S. role would have to be different. But if Israel and Iran got into another war, you have to assume the U.S. would at least be involved in supporting Israel's defense. So I don't think it's out of the question, as much as I hope that it doesn't come to that.
Well, yeah, we can do. We just have to wait and see. But I guess we'll get our first clues about what happens with the statements coming out of the White House here in just about 20 minutes from now. We'll be watching that, and then watching the Abraham Accords. If anything happens with that, that'll give you kind of canaries in the coal mine to be watching out for. Thanks so much for coming on today, Jennifer, and sharing this information with us. And we'll continue to watch and see what happens next.
Yep, I'll be watching too.